And the title of the speech is Ethical Leadership. Thank you, Harlan.
Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak to y'all this evening. Leadership is something we have discussed before. Leadership is obviously a very important part of everyday life. Whether you're a leader or you believe you're a leader, you truly are, regardless of your thoughts on that, even if you're leading yourself. But more importantly, I believe is ethics in that, because ethical leadership is paramount. It is so important to be ethical, not just to other people you deal with, but to yourself. Can you really look at yourself in a way that portrays ethics? But the question comes to mind, first of all, what are ethics? And why does it even matter? Simply put, ethics are knowing the difference between right and wrong. That's a pretty broad definition, right? Because if you are just trying to decide what's between right and wrong, it's totally up to you. And that is part of the issue. Because whenever we get to decide ourselves what is ethical and what is not, a lot of times we put ourselves in a situation where our views may not be congruent with somebody else's. And therefore, at what juncture do we decide who is correct? Well, through extensive training that I have to take because of my industry, annual certifications, and other continuing educations that I have on ethics, and of course, years and years of experience, not just as a self-employed individual, but also at the corporate level, where I spent nearly 20 years as a corporate employee looking at the ethics of a large corporation, dealing with entities such as those that do franchises, having a business where I interacted with the public on a daily basis as a servant, and then having one where I actually sell products. And now, once again, having the type of job where I decide, in many cases, what is right or wrong for a client. Ethics becomes a huge, huge deal. Because at what point do I decide that this is best for the client, even if it's not the best for me financially? That can be a very difficult thing to deal with. Imagine that you have to decide on something that may take money out of your pocket, but it's also the best thing for your client. I do that on a daily basis. It's really not that difficult for me, but I will tell you, for many, many people, that is a tough decision to make. And I think the record shows that a lot of people have a true tough time dealing with that. So what really impacts the development of your ethics to begin with? Well, most commonly, it's your family, it's your friends, it's mentors that you may have had. But the number one thing that truly impacts all that over the years is your experience. Because regardless of the way that you were raised, regardless of how your friends may influence you, your experience and how that shapes you is what will truly define your ethics, because it gives you a set of principles and values. And those principles and values are what help shapes all of those things. Are you consistent? Because that's a big part of what makes up your ethics. Are your principles consistent? Do you believe that honesty is always the best policy, but then you don't have that much problems lying about just little things? Are you real proactive in your principles? Do you know what to do? Or do you just know what not to do? How about, are you able to really evolve? Have you changed your principles and your values and your ethics at all since you were a young child? One would certainly hope so. But that's all part of the experience. That's all part of the process of learning. When you were a kid, do you remember the saying, might have even used it yourself, to your children or to someone else? Hey, you don't do what I do, you do what I say. Because it's okay for me, I'm the adult, but not you as a child. I don't know. Maybe that's just telling the child, when you get big, you can do whatever you want. That's kind of leading them down the wrong path. But I'll tell you what, I didn't turn out too bad. And I can promise you, I was told that more than once. It's not the worst thing you can hear, but it is if that's what you use to define it every single time. If every time you do something, you leave in other people's minds that it's a negative, but you are always telling them, well, no, you don't do that. You do what I tell you to do. Poor leadership there. Because if they're looking to the leader to lead, telling people to do one thing and doing something completely different is not going to give them the leadership and the values and the principles that they need. Do you think that you can have a set of principles, values, and ethics for a business and have a different set for your personal life? Maybe some people can. But very likely what's going to happen in these cases is there's going to be conflicts. There's going to be conflicts between those two where you simply cannot justify what you're doing on one side or the other. Always that balance. Where is the juncture that you're going to decide, I can't do this? I've got to make sure that whatever my business is weighs in the same as it does with my personal, or vice versa. I think many times we see people that are completely different, especially if they work for someone else now, completely different outside of their business as they are at work. Which one is the real them? For me, that's really hard to do business and work with people that, in my opinion, that are not true to themselves. I don't see them in any way, shape, or form as a leader, and maybe even a reliable person, because I see how they are in the real world, and that does not, to me, give that warm, fuzzy feeling to deal with them in a business environment, because I see that their values, their ethics are not consistent. Ethical thoughts should portray to ethical actions, and therefore you should have ethical consequences. Those three follow straight together. Think about what I said again. If you have ethical thoughts, that should relate into ethical actions. And then the consequences of that will be ethical consequences. It follows, it just makes sense. But the opposite also makes sense. If your thoughts are, how can I get away with this? How can I do this without getting caught? What's the best way to deceive? What's the best way to get away with this? Then you follow down that same trail. Your actions will follow that. And the consequences can be dire by going down that route, both personal and also professional. It's simply not the way that you should live your life, but many people simply do. Decisions based on poor ethics or what you can gain from these decisions, whether it be for your business or personal, can many times send you off the rails. I want to give you an example from my time as an environmental specialist when I worked for a large power company. We had an acid spill at one of the power plants. What had happened is a transfer line underground over time had been eaten away because of the low pH of the acid. It was designed to transfer acid, but not at the level pH where it was at. The pH was so low, in fact, that it was hardly measurable. It was almost zero, which is pretty acidic, by the way, and not a very good thing. But because of that pipe burst, it was not discovered in time to keep it from really contaminating a large area. And if you have any idea how pipelines, especially underground pipelines, are built, you don't just dig a trench and throw it in there. There has to be fill around it. And typically that fill is sand. Well, let me tell you, you get water or liquids of any kind in sand, it travels. It goes this way, it goes that way. And then, of course, it can contaminate the ground around there too. Well, when we found this problem, we have, of course, had to dig it up. We had to replace that pipe. At that point in time, there's a couple of things that could have happened. Once we had removed the main area where the acid was, and of course, we had to take lots of precautions. We're talking about a pretty bad situation here. We could have just covered it up, called it a day. But that really wasn't the ethical thing to do. I was in charge of this particular project, and I was getting a lot of pushback from the plant to go ahead and just close this project up. Let's just call it done. We need to call it done. We're spending a lot of money on this. Every one of these boxes of contaminated dirt, we had to spend hours upon hours neutralizing them with a caustic, which is a base, which is the opposite of an acid, if you didn't know. And you have to mix those together, and you spend hours working on this. So we had two projects going at one time. We had one digging stuff up and neutralizing, with the other getting the stuff out of the ground, continuing to work on here with a lot of testing going on. But the pressure, both from my bosses and from the plant to just pin this thing up, was pretty extreme. So I'm worried about my own safety. I'm worried about the safety of my guys I have down in the hole. I'm worried about making sure that everything is kept contaminated free, because we're using heavy equipment that is not really designed to dig acid. So you have to make sure it's all cleaned properly so you don't ruin the equipment. But I've also got to make sure that I'm following the government regulations, that everything's cleaned up properly. And that's what I did, much to the dismay of many of the people involved. For me personally, I'd have been better off getting out of that project. I didn't like being there. The air was terrible. I cannot tell you how many pairs of clothes I lost just being outside of the hole, away from it. The stuff would infuse in your clothes, and when you washed them, your clothes would fall apart. Crazy. My wife really wanted me to close that project down too. The gentleman working in the project probably wanted to be off of it, but I can promise you the company that we hired to do that did not, because they're getting paid pretty well every day. They're the only ones, I'm sure, that wanted the project to continue to go. But regardless of all of that pressure from the outside, I elected to keep the project open until we got results that showed we had cleaned up everything. There's a lot of negative consequences that could have happened, not only from the regulatory side, but from potential future problems in that plant. The plant didn't care. That was tomorrow's problem. But I looked at it in a very different way and said, no, it cannot be tomorrow's problem. It's got to be today's. And I think that that was probably one of the very first times in the leadership capacity that I had to make what I would consider now a very ethical decision, very tough ethical decision that I knew could have a negative impact on my career with that company. But I went ahead and made it, and it wasn't the popular decision. In other instances, whether I was running a catering business or a restaurant, dealing with employees, there's always those times when you have to make ethical decisions. I can remember getting a memo from our franchise when I ran a restaurant saying, we're going to continue to serve this plate of food, and we're going to continue to call it the exact same thing, but I want you to give people less. This is a cost-saving measure. We're not going to change the prices. We've already done that, but now we're going to give people less. I disagreed completely. We didn't do that in our restaurants. That's not the way we were going to do business. If I'm going to call it the same thing and tell people you're getting the same amount, I don't care if it's 2 or 3 bites of each thing. That's not right. They're expecting a certain product. They're expecting a certain result. they're expecting a certain amount. Not getting what you paid for and not knowing about it doesn't make it right. It still wasn't ethical. And I let them know what my position was. The letter I sent back to them, I hope they got it on a wall somewhere, because it was not a very nice letter. They were certain that after that, the San Antonio restaurants would not be participating in their deceit. I was having none of it. Now, ethics can also roll over into something else. And this goes back to those same restaurant days. And I was putting in 6 to 7, 18-hour days every single week. While I was giving everything that I had to my business, I was giving little to nothing to my family. Ethically, for me personally, that was very wrong. It hurt the relationship I had with my wife, hurt the relationship I had with my son. It hurt the relationship I had even with myself, you can say, because I was not being true to myself. My principles and values were that I was a good, solid family man. My actions did not betray that. The consequences were strife at home, terrible, terrible relationship with my son for a long time. They were very, very negative. My leadership, my ethical leadership was very, very poor, because my values that I had set for myself personally were not flowing over into my business, and I was letting that control everything about me. And that was a very, very poor leadership decision on my behalf. I am glad to say that the main reason for my decision to get out of that business was because I was losing my family. And I chose my family over something that was truly my dream from whenever I was much younger, and that was to own restaurants and run them. I do not recommend it to anybody because it is a very tough business and you have no time for your family. I guess you had nothing else to do in the world. It's a great deal. It wasn't for me. I did not overall enjoy the experience. While it was a lot of fun sometimes, the strain on my family and the strain even on my ethics and my values and my principles was just too much to stay in that industry. And if I'd have stayed there, I would have never got to know all y'all. So I'm really glad that I moved on into the insurance world. And we're going to talk about that a little bit now too, because as I mentioned earlier, every single day I get to decide what the best course for my clients is. Now think about that for a second. People are putting their financial and in many cases, health well-beings in my hands and asking me, well, which plan is the best for me? And I have to let them know which plan is the best for them, not which plan is the best for me financially. Years ago, that may have been pretty difficult for me to swallow, because how am I going to do this and continue to feed my family, right? Wow, man, what a tough decision this is. But experience, man, experience. I just love experience because it has taught me that they go hand in hand. You do the best for people. You follow ethical leaderships and ethical principles, and you have ethical values. And it all comes back around. You do what's right, and people see that. And they refer friends and neighbors and family. And you feel good about yourself. Being an ethical leader can be very, very difficult at times. But deciding what is right and what is wrong, which is what ethics is all about, is up to each of us individually. It depends on your circumstances. It depends on truly just what you feel. And no one can tell you that. You have to decide that all on your own. But when you find a business where your ethics works for you, where you can really just flourish in a leadership role and an industry that is just made for you, it does not become, it's just not hard. It does not become an issue. It becomes something that just flows through you. You just know this is what I was made for. And in closing, I would just like to challenge every one of you to look at what your ethical makeup is, to think about what your principles and values are, maybe even write those down, and make sure that every day you are thinking, acting, and enjoying the consequences of ethical leadership. Madam Toastmaster.
Thank you, Harlan.